today to speak about this important discussion about fighting racism in our communities and the role of responsibilities of municipalities in taking on that work. My relatives, my name is Seema Alawalia, and I'm really honored to serve as the second VP and co-chair of the VLDC's Anti-Racism Committee. I'm going to tell you about our program, but I want to start with where we always need to start. And that is, before we move into our discussion today, to state the fact that VDLC and our offices are located in the sacred and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have stewarded these territories since time immemorial. We acknowledge the collective and inherent rights of self-determination of Indigenous peoples all over Great Turtle Island as the holders of underlying title of their territories, and we seek to build respectful and productive relationships with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and to be a welcoming space for Indigenous workers of all nations who reside in your shared territories. The concerns and needs of Indigenous workers are important to center in our policies, practices, and collective agreements. And my relatives, now it is my great privilege and honor to introduce to you Mr. Sam George, a respected Tsleil-Waututh member and a junior elder, who has kindly agreed to provide us with a traditional greeting. Sam, such an honor, and it is with great gratitude that I thank you for joining us today.
Osia, Haichka, thank you very much, everybody. I raise my hands in great gratitude for allowing me to do these customs and traditions. You know, these are our protocols. As introduced, my name is Sam George. I am Sam George Jr. I come from a long line of residential school survivors. You know, my great-grandparents both attended. My grandparents attended. Both of my parents attended. I attended day school. My children are the first line in our bloodline to not actually have to attend a residential school. So I introduce myself that way because we have to get over that word history. That history isn't about our people. You know, history is about what happened to our people. And now we're sharing, these are our traditions and customs that have been happening for thousands and thousands of years. And I raise my hands in gratitude for recognizing that there was a history before history. You know, this is how we reconcile. You know, this is how we move towards where true reconciliation is, by doing and recognizing that there was a history before the history. And so we got to keep doing these protocols and traditions, because that's how we're going to heal as a people. You know, it's difficult to go and talk and do these talks and talk about the things that have happened, because it's not just a story, it's our life. If you know a First Nations person, either they've attended or know somebody or had a relative attend a day school or a boarding school in the United States that was called boarding school. So, you know, it's fresh still. It's still fresh. You know, the last residential school closed in 1996 in Canada. You know, that's not too long ago. And when I go do talks at universities and schools, I make sure that I get these points in there, because these are the things that are important that we need to talk about. You know, that's how we're going to move forward and fix the history of Canada and what it's done to its First Peoples. So when we start our day as Tsleil-Waututh people, we start with a blessing, and I'd like to offer up a blessing to start your day. Hosiam, Haichka, thank you. Creators and grandfathers and grandmothers, I thank you for allowing me to open up my eyes today and be on this world and this journey still. I thank you for yesterday and the beautiful day I was able to enjoy with my daughter getting married. Hosiam, Haichka, thank you. And I ask you, creator, grandfathers, and grandmothers, to look after everybody in this virtual circle in a good way. Lay that cloak of protection and love on them, and answer their prayers and any pains that they may have in them right now, and take those pains away and turn it into love in a good way. With that, I say, Haichka, and thank you. Hosiam. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your powerful and your loving words. Thank you for that cloak of protection and for all the teachings you shared with us in that short time. Again, it's such an honor to have you here today. And we understand that you're very busy today. So if you need to leave early, we just send our love and best wishes to your daughter and all the relatives for this wonderful celebration going on in your family. And I'm sure the whole nation is celebrating. So thank you
Oh,
again.
see, yeah, all my kids are starting to arrive for breakfast now, so I got to get going. Sorry.
All right, you go have those yummy pancakes.
Yeah, much love and respect. Hosiam. Take care.
Oh, see. And so my relatives, I just want to remind you this event is being recorded. So certainly fine if you want to leave your cameras off. After the event, we do have a question and answer period. And I've got two members of my anti-racism wrecking crew here, my co-chair Gina and Shabina, and they will be moderating the question period. So you can either raise your virtual hand or you can turn your camera on and raise your real hand. And either way, Shabina and Gina will call on you to offer your comment or question. And so before we move forward, I would also now like to invite a leader who I have great respect and look up to, and that is the president of VDLC, President Stephen von Sichowski. So Stefan, could you kindly say a few words?
Thanks, Seema, and good morning, everyone. My name's Stefan von Sichowski. I'm the president of the Labor Council. My pronouns are he and him. And I want to say a few words, start off with acknowledging that I am joining this event from the unceded territory of the Katzie and Kwantlen First Nations. And I really want to thank the Anti-Racism Committee for organizing this event again this year, the third annual webinar that the committee has put together. They've all been very wonderful, very important conversations. And it's great to see that work continuing again this year. That's really an example of why this committee is so important. And if there's folks here, and I'm sure there are, lots of you are on the Zoom from our affiliates, we welcome you into this committee. There's lots of work to be done. The Anti-Racism Committee was really just founded 3 years ago, not that long before that first webinar, and has done, I think, so much important work educating our members and putting our anti-racist beliefs and intentions into action. It's really been thanks to the hard work of a small cohort of dedicated people, led by the chairperson of the committee, Seema Ahluwalia, and co-chair Gina Cho, and a small group of amazing Labor Council activists who make all of this happen. Racism is a product of our colonial capitalist socio-economic system that we live in. It's systemic. We've also seen how it's been historically weaponized by bosses, by employers and their governments against workers through divide and rule tactics, which ultimately undermine the political, economic, and social interests of workers of all backgrounds. There's no quick fix for something that has its historic roots in the very beginnings of our society, that's so deeply systemically integrated with every aspect of our system and expresses itself in so many different varied forms. But on the other hand, it won't fix itself either, right? We know that there's no magical march of progress that just happens automatically through the passage of time. These changes that we need in our society come through hard work and struggle. They come from people making them, right? And so I'm very proud to be part of a Labor Council that's setting out to do our part in that work. One of the areas that some of that work can happen is through electoral politics, which is what we're going to discuss a bit today. Governments can do a lot to reduce the harm of racism and reduce it in our communities and mitigate its impacts, or they can do a lot to fan the flames of bigotry and division. And we're seeing that right now, I think. Certainly in Canada and the United States, we're seeing how governments or political parties can set out to do either one of those things, and how it's important to engage in political action to make sure that the right folks are, in the seats of power. And then that's not the end of the story, that it's our job then to hold them to account and to continue to push for progress. We've definitely seen both of those things in Metro Vancouver as well over the years. Our Labor Council was founded in 1889. And since that time, we've been a consistent presence in the municipal political scene. And, I think a significant influence over much of that time. And we have to recognize that at certain points, that influence has not been used in the way that we would want it to be today. And that influence has been used in a way, unfortunately, that divided workers against each other instead of uniting us as a class. The most well-known and shameful example of that was obviously the Labor Council's involvement in the anti-immigrant, anti-Asian politics of the early 1900s, especially the anti-Asian riots of 1907. Probably, without a doubt, the most shameful, embarrassing period of an otherwise largely pretty proud history of fighting for working people in this city. And as shameful as that episode may be, it can't be undone. We recognized our involvement in those events and apologized on the 100th anniversary, but an apology also needs to come with action. It's not enough just to say words. And that's why we're continue to commit ourselves to doing this work now and in the future. That we bring together a significant group of workers across the city, a diverse group of workers across the city, not only in terms of the breadth of the economy that our members cover, but different folks from different backgrounds and so on and so forth. And we bring those folks together to work together and make change. And we know that we can do that, and we can do that in a very positive way. And what better time to have this discussion than now? We know that elections are around the corner, provincially, federally, probably a by-election municipally, a municipal election in 2026. This is going to be a heavy period of political action over the next couple of years. And so we need to really think about how do we harness that to advance progress, to advance anti-racism? How do we do that together? And so I really want to thank the Anti-Racism Committee. I really want to thank the panelists, Sam for the traditional opening, Sadie and Am and Jennifer for being here today and sharing their thoughts and knowledge with us. And I want to thank all of you for being here as well. On a Sunday morning to learn, to share, and I guess ultimately, hopefully, to come out of this working together to continue to make a better world. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back over to Seema, our chairperson for the day.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I always tease Stefan because he's so young looking. When he grew a beard, I said he just looks like a 14-year-old with the best beard I ever saw. But the truth is, he's such an honorable and hardworking man. It's such an honor to work with him. And what he failed to mention is he is one of the hardworking members of the Anti-Racism Committee. And regardless of his millions of other responsibilities, he rarely misses a meeting. So thank you, Stefan, for all of your support for this work. And so now it's my absolute honor and privilege to begin our discussion. And I will start with our esteemed first speaker, Sadie Kuehn. Many of you already know who Sadie is. She is a renowned and long-time Vancouver resident, educator, writer, policy developer, managing editor, and labor, social, and economic justice activist. Sadie's resume, it just reads like a list of firsts. She is the first Black person or person of color to be elected as a trustee to the Vancouver School Board in the mid-80s. She's the first person of color to lead a major municipal political party and the first person of color to chair a major civic committee, the Family Court Youth Justice Committee of Vancouver. Sadie's work reflects a lifelong commitment to justice, inclusion, and fairness. She speaks out locally and globally against racism, violence, and other forms of discrimination. And she contributes her time and efforts towards building an inclusive, accessible, fair, and just society by speaking out and working against systemic injustices, including racism, violence, and other forms of discrimination. And Sadie does this locally, nationally, and internationally. Most recently, Sadie has served as co-chair of VPD African Descent Advisory Committee, My relatives, please help me welcome Sadie Kuehn, our first speaker. Welcome, Sadie.
Hello, everyone. And Seema, thank you and the Labor Council for including me in this discussion. I'm very excited to be here with colleagues, many colleagues that are here too. What I wanted to do today is to take my time to actually do kind of an overview. And I wanted to start at a place of talking about who we are as a part of the Canadian social fabric. That for me, my reality, growing up, actually when I grew up, when I was born, and as a young adult, operating in an environment where I wasn't allowed to vote, and recognizing how important, coming from a community that believed very much that voting was a major, major honor to be able to take part in that process of engaging in discussions and then getting out and voting. So what I want to talk about is democracy and what our role is as a part of a democracy. We as individuals, what our individual roles are, and also how that connects into us joining together, supporting communities to be engaged and active as well, but also how that encourages the kind of government that we all desire, that will benefit not just only us, but our whole community and all of the people that are included in it. And as a part of that, understanding that none of us are just lone and only a part of something. So when we're talking about anti-racism as a part of this process, we know that as individuals, as people of color, as Indigenous people and other people of color, we understand that ultimately we are mothers, we are parents, we are members of the LGBT community, we are many things, and that we can't just look at one piece of what we are, but look at the totality, of all of what we are when we are engaged in the struggle to create what Canada likes to talk about, a just and fair society. In terms of us as individuals being a part of that process, it is critically important that each of us take on the responsibility of understanding what it means to be a part of a democracy. We cannot sit back and be silent. We have to engage in our community and providing direction to the people that we select to run our municipal government and our provincial governments and our national governments. Without our engagement and commitment to bringing about the kind of justice policies that we believe in as individuals and work in that work, things will not change. So my call to all of you and to myself is to recognize our responsibility, not just to our little groupings, but to the whole, that as a part of our work, that we need to lift each other up and to demonstrate our commitment to doing what we historically have said that we've been committed to, and that is fairness and justice for all. That does not mean that we don't recognize the particular experiences of a wide diversity of people, and at every point be able to raise those matters and put them front and center. The matter of Indigenous people across this land who were identified clearly in the original discussions at different tables as equal partners have now often been relegated to second-class citizens. And again, it's something that we need to speak out about and continue to support their total right to make decisions for themselves and to be in whatever way they need to be and want to be a part of the overall process and structures that exist. But we can't dismiss the experiences of other folks of color and members of the LGBT community. I find it interesting that many of us have forgotten that it has not been that long ago that being a member of the LGBT community and two-spirited community was seen to be a problem, that it was illegal, that people went to jail, they were brutalized because they were a part of that community. Again, it isn't good enough to, when we see things happening in our community that violates the rights and the privilege and the equality of any peoples, that we have to demand that that not be the case. We need to do it individually and we need to do it collectively. Many of you know that I'm a longtime advocate and have been committed to the labor movement, not only here in this province, but also in the Deep South where I was born, which I left at 17. And how important it has been, not only for me, but for the Black community generally, to support labor rights, to be in marches and to advocate in terms of policies and position papers that labor be afforded the dignity and the support that we all can give it in every construct. We also know that historically that people of African descent in the US and in Canada has not had the full benefit of supports of many unions. And in many unions, they were outlawed early on. I'm glad to say that much of that has changed. And as Stephen said, I think that we all recognize that there is more work to be done. We are heading into major challenges in Canada in terms of our overall political structures. We know that right-wing ideology and thought is pressing us further and further to the right. I guess in some of what I've been concerned about is the number of people who are not willing to stand up and speak out when matters come up and are really problematic. We need to I believe that we need to take on the challenge and stand up to hate, stand up to violence, stand up to abuse of people who are seen to be identified as being different from us in any way and problematic. And it takes me to a period when in discussions of situations around transgendered people and how folks wanted to bar them from different environments and different situations. And the reality is that at any given point, that could happen to any of us. And for us to understand and to remember that at any point, a particular group or an individual can be demonized and made to be seen as other. Those are ways, as we know, separates us and makes us unable then to come together to fight a bigger enemy. And that's the fear and the kind of hatred that's out there that at any particular time can be targeted against any of us for the way we look, the way we carry ourselves, who we care about, who we love, who our families are, what our religion might be. It doesn't look at that kind of attitude, doesn't look at the quality of the human being and their commitment to working together to bring about the kinds of change that we need. And we need to move further to that place to be willing to say that we will stand with people, whoever they might be, who stand for justice, fairness, and equality, and to be seen to be doing that. And again, I'll say that as a part of a member of a democracy, that is our responsibility and our obligation is to do just that. And I'll leave it there because you can probably hear that I'm kind of losing my voice. But thank you so much.
Sadie, thank you so much for your powerful words. Thank you for all your activism over all these decades, and thanks for, through your words, taking us back to that original wisdom of our labor movement, which is we must educate, we must agitate, we must organize. Our strength comes from our solidarity. And thank you for reminding us of the intersections of discrimination that create multiple jeopardies for so many members of our community. Thank you for lifting up the concerns of the LGBTQI community, reminding us that, you know, today the lives of transgender women of color they're facing that violence, you know, like no other ones in our community. So I'm really grateful for everything you shared with us today. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jennifer Reddy. Jennifer was born and raised on traditional unceded Tunaja territories to immigrant parents. Jennifer holds a BA and an MA that focuses on social policy and development studies, and she uses her expertise and educational background to encourage and engage in meaningful dialogues that lead to creative solutions to complex issues. in areas like policy and program development, in public education, governance, and settlement and integration. Jennifer is a second-term trustee with the Vancouver School Board, and currently Jennifer is the Senior Equity Advisor to the Hospital Employees Union. She has, again, most recently been co-developing equity training materials and curriculum for international policymakers and post-secondary educators. Jennifer, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Wow, thanks, Seema. Yeah, that's a real mishmash in the bio. And I guess the reason is that also brings me to this conversation today, I think, is just seeking as many methods as possible to shift the systems that we're in, whether it's policy or education or art or electoral participation. So yeah, I would say that it's all of the above that kind of brings me to this place. And I'm really glad that the VDLC is actually working so hard at bringing so many of us together. It brings me a lot of joy to see so many folks on the call today, to recognize that you're prioritizing this, because the urgency of doing anti-racism work never stops. And so it's, yeah, thank you so much, Seema, for the invitation, and for Stefan, for your leadership at the VDLC, and also to Sadie and who I look to for a lot of guidance and inspiration to continue doing the work on the municipal front. So my name's Jennifer, my pronouns are she, her. I'm joining you today from unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It was really wonderful to start this day with Junior Elder Sam George, and I think he rightfully reminds us how recent some of these experiences of human rights violations have been. And I think, Sadie, you pointed out how critical it is that we don't let off the pressure of some of the issues that we're seeing come forward now through governments. And so the kind of short answer for me of some of this work is that it doesn't ever stop. And that's a really good thing, because it keeps bringing us together, and we keep fighting against injustices that affect people in our communities. So I wanted to just start, and I've got two questions that I'll leave folks with. Because as I mentioned, the work is quite far-reaching, and there's a lot of ways to do this work. And so I'll leave folks with two questions, but I wanted to start by recognizing my own introduction into the world of labor and anti-racism work. And that is through growing up on unceded lands in the East Kootenays. My parents and my ancestors come from a line of individuals who are indentured laborers. So after slavery was abolished, the colonial powers were looking for a cheap form of labor. So what happened is a lot of us were moved to different countries. Ours was Fiji, on the promise of housing and food if we were to work straight for 4 to 6 years. There were a lot of children laborers that were taken from their families. And after the 4 to 6 years was up, there wasn't, of course, enough money to send those kids back home. And so they ended up staying and settling in different parts of the world. So when my parents decided to immigrate here in the 70s, it was pretty exciting to come to a place that had an operating democracy. You know, we participated in elections. I went with my parents to the voting stations. But I also remember writing letters to my father's steelworkers union about safety violations. So he and a lot of his fellow immigrant members in the mining community and in the union would experience quite a few safety violations when they were in the workforce. And not only that, but some of them would become injured and lost their lives while they were working in the coal mine. And it was now really apparent to me why they were given some of the most difficult, dangerous jobs without safety equipment, without hard hats, and why they were begging for things like harnesses when they're working on really high machinery. So there I was at age 10, writing these letters to the safety folks and to the union, asking for support. And I think Stefan opened by rightly pointing out that labor has its own history, being one of the leaders against progressive labor movements, and starting in Vancouver, the Asiatic Exclusion League with card-holding members. So there's a lot of racist leadership within the labor movement, as there is within our own communities. And so all this to say that it's a choice. We are parts of larger communities that make choices about the values and principles that we're going to lead with. During the Japanese internment, the Longshoremen Union was one of the only unions to speak out against Japanese internment, against the government, in fact, because these were all legislated examples of racism. So it was difficult for people to speak out, but unions spoke out. The labor longshoreman union was the one to actually take to the streets and say, no, we want to protect our members. We don't agree with Japanese internment. So again, an example of choice within our unions. And at the same time, I think our political parties have a bit of a parallel there where we choose to take anti-racist positions. And when we don't, we actually might inadvertently create more problems for the communities that we're trying to represent. So in the school board context, I will say this is my second term. I've been elected with other young people, with other people of color, with other women, with other people who have kids, who are educators, and then everyone else as well. But I will say that we don't necessarily share values. And a lot of times we actually don't have the same perspective. So as soon as this last election came through in 2021, folks, I'd get calls, and that's great. You have so many people of color at school board and council. This is wonderful. And I thought, what are they talking about? Because our values couldn't be more different from each other. And so that was a real wake-up call for me that folks aren't really paying attention to what kind of actions parties are taking, what kind of positions they're taking, what they're not saying, but also how they might be or not be voting at the table. And that scares me the most, is because it might give us some relief to know, oh, good, there's, other parents at the table. So somebody will take care of, the instructional supplies and the lunch programs and the neighborhood schools. No, unless all of us, like in this call and then some, show up to say, actually, no, that affects all of us. And we want to make sure you're voting to support the resources, the position, the values that we all have. And so just showing up at election time is only one piece of the puzzle. And I find it most supportive when community members are showing up actually to the meeting, sending letters, showing up to speak. And that scares the crap out of municipal electeds. And that's a really important sign, is that when we don't want to hear people or we don't want them in our decision-making spaces, we need to ask why. And so my experience at school board has been, the inadequate funding and support of, for example, school food programs. Now, anyone on this call may or may not know the importance of school food programs, but what ends up happening is that the issues are so compartmentalized. Food programs support lots of kids from different families at different points in their lives. Right now, in particular, we're in an affordability crisis as a city. And when kids show up hungry, it makes it impossible for them to learn. Their teachers, support staff, all the building services, the trades, the engineers, they struggle with kids who are hungry in schools because they can't sit still, they can't learn. So providing, for example, a universal food program actually helps us relieve the pressure off the entire system, because we're looking after kids when they come through the door, regardless of what their socioeconomic status might be, which, by the way, changes over time and fluctuates. Parents gain and lose employment, people move, families change in composition. So the kinds of people I see come out and speak about, for example, food programs, are usually just a couple of individuals who have to disclose their identity and their need for a lunch program. But what really changes the room is when they come with other people who say, yeah, we want to protect the school food program too, and may or may not have had experience using the food program, but instead can stand up beside others who actually really need the program and shouldn't have to disclose their desperate need for the food program in order to protect it. So I would say my first kind of question to folks here and to myself all the time is, who are we showing up with? I find it very difficult to do this work alone. And a lot of you in this room are allies. I know you've sent letters, you've spoken up in different platforms, you come to public meetings, and that honestly, truly is one of the key places to make a difference, because it's scary to be the only voice saying, hey, I think we need to hear a little bit more on the school food program. And that's kind of the point, is that if you're the only voice speaking out, it takes a lot of courage, but it makes it a lot easier if there's people beside you and amplify your message. The kind of two other pieces I mentioned was instructional supplies in neighborhood schools, that those are key equity aspects to helping everyone in our community, all kids, all families, be able to walk and roll to a school in their neighborhood. And when they can't, we're not including them in our system. And that isn't just a race-based issue. There are people in many different situations that require the ability to get to a close neighborhood school and get the instructional supplies that they need in order to have a fulfilling educational experience. One example of what I'll kind of say that we can watch out for is the representation of individuals who are elected in the municipal, the provincial, the federal scene, really taking care to make sure that we're not just assuming that they represent all of us. And I need to be careful as an elected person that when I'm asked, Jennifer, what does the immigrant community think about, that I'm not answering that question because I am not a representative voice of all immigrant communities, or all women or people of color or even Indigenous folks. And so it's my responsibility to find out what those groups are thinking and feeling and needing and bring them into the room to amplify their own voice. But I will say that it's very easy for our municipal setting to actually tokenize individuals like myself who are the one sort of progressive voice or one of two or one of three. And I would say that this really took hold when we saw the police return back to schools in 2021, that we actually had a previous board who did a consultation, found out that police presence in Vancouver schools was causing harm, and that we didn't have empirical evidence demonstrating that, in fact, they were improving children's access to public education. We even received the BC Human Rights Commissioner's warning to say, unless you have empirical evidence, there's no reason to even entertain bringing police back in schools. But here we had a newly elected ABC government and the one another person of color saying at the table, actually, we really love having police in schools, and on behalf of like all the people in our community, we would love to welcome them back. And just with so much audacity to think that they represent everybody, but in fact, they use that position of power to cause harm to people who have come out and spoken up. They've disclosed their names, their children's names, their experiences to express the harm that they've had and are still being ignored and then generalized. So the last question I'll say to you is that this work, if you can't tell, is very difficult and requires a lot of constant attention and response. So I would ask you to think about how you can take care of yourself, but who else can support you in the work. So for me, I would say being able to tap other folks to talk about police in school so that it's not always me is one example. Being able to bring other people into the conversation about food security in schools is another one. And there's many more, but just to say that it isn't any one person's responsibility, and we do need to lend a hand when we're maybe not directly impacted, but do have a voice, and also recognize when to ask for help. So yeah, really glad to kind of start this conversation off. I hope I've given some ideas of what's been going on in the municipal area. And there's a lot more we can talk about. So we'd love to stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate your questions. I really appreciate how your comments really echoed some of the important points Sadie was making as well. And I'm really, really happy that you brought this prickly issue to the forefront. And for me, it reminds me of what happens when Indigenous people and racialized minorities make headway in the public discourse about racism or other forms of discrimination. The anti-racist backlash that happens includes the government reforming its state-sponsored discourse to co-opt elements of, you know, the radical calls for justice. And so that's how we got EDI. That's how we got the Canadian government now claiming that it's an anti-racist agent and an agent for decolonization. While it defies logic, that stuff is out there. And I'm really glad that you brought out the reality that the Vancouver School Board is populated by many non-white people. And they have collectively brought in some very regressive policies. And it's been very sad to see that parents of Indigenous students, Black students, children in foster care, children with disabilities, all those children who we have evidence-based research, that they are being disadvantaged by these school liaison officers, which are really promoting what's something that even the American government acknowledges, the school to prison pipeline. And so as anti-racist activists, you know, we need to not fall into those traps where, oh, we have a Chinese mayor, so suddenly that means we're in a post-racial society. These kinds of ludicrous comments, they really are attacks on our solidarity, and then they invite us to be more clear. As you say, who are we standing up for? Who are we showing up for? And how are we speaking out collectively? So again, thank you so much for your important comments. And finally, it is my great privilege to introduce our third speaker again. He's no stranger to the labor movement and to those who activate for social justice in our communities, and that is, of course, Johal, currently the director of SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement, and also a co-director of SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative. Am provided me with a very humble bio, so I guess there's just too much he could say he's been involved with, but Am is on the board of the Vancouver International Film Festival and Greenpeace Canada, and he's also the co-author of a book that was recently published with another storied community activist, Matt Hearn, and together they have co-authored the book, Oh My Friends, There Is No Friend, The Politics of Friendship at the End of Ecology. So my relatives, please help me welcome Johal. Thanks for being here, Am.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Seema, and I'm coming to you from territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and thank you for the words, Sam, George, and Stefan, Sadie, and Jennifer as well. I had some things written down, but I think I'm going to go off script a little bit just to build on the important words that have already come today. I grew up in the interior of BC in Williams Lake and Chouette Mountain Territory. My parents come from what is today Pakistan, but they're sort of, the families come from the partition period of India. My father was born before partition, my mother after, and so part of the displacements of land and the shakings of economy is how they found themselves immigrating to here. And I was around my parents oftentimes when, you know, words were spoken. It was part of the lived experience of being in rural Canada. And in as much as my father was a lumber grader, a member of the IWA, laid a steelworker, my mother cleaned hotel rooms, non-unionized, barely above minimum wage. And seeing the kind of evolution in these small communities of what was deeply racist redneck communities to something better than that, but still problems that exist there today. And there's something about witnessing, seeing that politics that come with a kind of trauma of growing up, the challenges of identity, of being proud of one's culture, and at the same time wanting to belong in this place, and seeing that unfold over a long period of time. And there's something about the reactionary politics today that have been unleashed, not just in the US, but certainly that exist here, that have long and deep histories. I'm glad Stefan mentioned the anti-Asiatic riots, the Komagata-Maru. There's just so many we could go through. But when we see those words come back and uttered, go back to where you come from, like all of these kinds of things that are part of the discussion that on the street of the everyday, on public transit. I walk between Strathcona to Woodwards on most mornings. I could, you know, it's basically 2 or 3 times a week I'm hearing or seeing something. We all see it around us. And I think that's part of the challenge of like what it brings up when we see forces that we thought were long past come back in the present. And there's something about that that I think it's really important to unpack and work through. But the politics, you know, the ones that we try to evoke in the book that I work on with Matt, but when we start talking about friendship and community, you know, adjacent words like love and solidarity come up. People are on different trajectories, different backgrounds. And so how do we engage with people? You know, I'm Facebook friends with people I went to elementary school with who are openly supporting the convoy. And so there's ways that I have attempted to connect with people on the basis of that they came from a working class background, but maybe their analysis might not be quite right. And that I choose at that individual level because I've known people for a long time to still engage. At other places that, you know, I choose to disengage because nothing's going to come from it, or it takes too much out of me. At the municipal level, I sit on the advisory committee for the labor studies program at SFU, where a number of people, retired members of the labor movement, continue to be involved. So I really love that form of engagement. And I think that it also brings in the practicality of workplace issues, of where this stuff lands down on the ground. These principles of duty to accommodate that the labor movement has put forward are so important. You know, I give the example of, you know, I had a co-op student, a Muslim co-op student. We did a lot of evening events. She needed a prayer room in our building. You know, these are just little things. Once you educate people in the workplace, that you can open up these spaces where people can bring their whole selves into the workplace, that these forms of inclusion, we need to go far, far further than we have been able to. I'm glad there was mentioning around sexual orientation, gender inclusion. I work out of 312 Main Street, where one of the provincial advocacy organizations are based. And there was a protest of groups that came across the building on Cordova Street. And so they were basically yelling at everyone who came out of the building, whether they worked with that organization or not. So in some sense, this principle of solidarity is so important. It's like it's directed towards one group, but it's directed to everyone who's in the building. And this is the principle by which, if we don't, you know, hold hands together, if we don't fight together, that we are going to all be vulnerable at some point. And so I do think that we need better and more places of having the capacity to organize and resist, to bring analysis to the table where that discussion can happen. I don't think that we have enough spaces and places to do that. There is work that's been done at the municipal level, like some of it by the provincial government. There's some work that was done at the YWCA, and I'll send those resources through SEMA that they can be shared. But once again, most people don't know about these resources existing, and so it's one of the challenges of state-funded processes and approaches. And you know, it's interesting, when I was in the student union at UBC and sitting on these committees, and at the time they just used the word diversity, right? And they would just go through the motions and it's like, yes, it's important, but you know, we're not going to do that. They would just be like, you know, that's great, that's laudable, but we're just not going to. They would just say it right to your face. And so, you know, 30 years go by and the language is slightly changed into equity, diversity, inclusion. The senior areas of the university still have not changed in terms of their levels of diversity. I think things have gone much further. And so I'm hesitant to critique kind of what they're attempting to do, or the people who work inside these spaces trying to move the dial. But it's also, we need to go much, much further, as many of you have articulated, that the state-driven or the other types of approaches are inadequate to the broader calls for justice that we're demanding. And they don't, the things that happen in the everyday as well. I think it's really important to look at, you know, the importance of arts and cultural funding. You know, the city of Vancouver, in redoing their art and cultural plan, there was, you know, finally a recognition that, you know, who gets funded were, you know, these larger institutions, and they didn't reflect the diversity of the city. And so things have been put into the plans, and now it's going to take much longer to work its way through the system. But it's really, for those of you who haven't had a chance to go to the Chinese Canadian History Museum on Pender Street, it's a remarkable example of curating, you know, some of these deep politicized histories, the impacts of them, the educative qualities, but also the production of solidarity that comes from the sharing of these stories in a way that's a demand for a better world built around a different value system. I'm involved a little bit with the co-chairing the ministerial advisory around the South Asian History Museum. And boy, let me tell you, it's complicated stuff. The term itself is a problem. What are the borders of South Asia? Why do these things fit together? And when you pull people together, the idea that this is going to be some sort of a coherent project, even in the early stages. So we have a lot of work to do within and between communities as well. I think one other area I would raise as well is that amongst BIPOC racialized communities, there's also histories of racism within them, and they're difficult to talk about. And I think we need to talk about them, whether we're talking about, within the South Asian community, the discussions about caste or anti-Black racism, or there was a term in the 70s and the 80s in immigrant communities, and it was called taike, which was a respectful term for Indigenous people. That it means your father's older brother. It was meant as a term of respect and endearment. But also it depends on who said it and how they said it. If they also used it as a derogatory term for people who weren't progressive. And so when that word gets brought out and only spoken about in the positive way, gets written about by organizations to get arts and cultural funding as this sign of solidarity between South Asian people and Indigenous people, it's also a yes, but, right? And so we need to kind of unpack those areas where there have been racisms and frictions, because I think to bring it out into the open also is to produce new forms of solidarity as well. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done between and amongst communities on that front as well. I think also I would do one other thing I'll just finish off with so we have time for questions and comments and discussion. But also I think these larger questions around climate change, climate emergency, it's very much, working class people, racialized communities that are going to be on the front line of the impacts around, heat waves and all of these things, who has air conditioners, who doesn't, to where they live in the city, how they're going to be mobile to be able to work, all of those pieces, the impact on the transit system. And many of the questions around the climate emergency don't address things from a working class perspective or a racialized perspective to the depth that they need to go. And so we see kind of institutionalized forms of racism built into planning that does not go far enough to express these concerns. So I'll just just end with saying that when we think about friendship and community as a mode of organizing, this broader question of how to be together comes from the beginning stages of philosophy in the Western tradition, in the Eastern tradition, from the African tradition, that we have not yet solved the problem of how to be together. And anti-racism work done through friendship, community, solidarity, love is part of this broader question of figuring out how to be together, how to live together in a way that we can thrive. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your words. And I can't believe after all these decades, I've never had a chance to meet you and shake your hand. I hope that happens someday. We share a lot of history. My parents are also coming out of, partition with generations of family dislocated, and then coming to Saskatchewan in the 60s. And my own experience of racism, as you can imagine, in a rural setting in Saskatchewan, was still, like most of us, settlers, focused on my own survival. And as much as I was an anti-racist activist by the time I was 15, I didn't really know much about racism until I married a traditional Lakota man from a family with a long history of fighting colonization. And so the solidarity that you and Jennifer and Sadie are talking to us about today is so much more deeper than just sort of like meeting other members of our community and really understanding what racism is and how it is rooted in dispossession and genocide, and how all of us coming to Canada, regardless of our color, we are coming here as settlers to build the Canadian state. And that necessarily puts us into a relationship with Indigenous peoples that we may not want to be, but that we have to collectively unpack and work towards those peaceful models of coexistence that have always existed on this continent. The treaties, the peace and friendship agreements that Indigenous peoples have, not just with other human nations, but with the nations of, trees and plants and animals. So much for us to learn and so much for us to activate. So your words resonate so deeply with all of us, and I thank you so much. And now we have that opportunity to go to all of our wonderful guests here today and welcome you now to raise your hands and offer any comments or questions that you want to offer as we continue this dialogue. I saw Caitlin's hand go up, Shabina and Gina. I don't know if there was anyone before Caitlin.
No, I didn't see anyone.
Caitlin, did you still want, I saw your hand go up. Do you want to ask a question? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone's hands up right now. Oh, Dylan H. Go ahead, Dylan.
Hi, thank you. I think this question applies pretty broadly to all the speakers. If you want to answer it, anyone's welcome to. But it's just building off of this topic of friendship. And I'm just one conversation or I guess discussion and problem I don't hear discussed is like, how do we reach out to people that with whom we disagree? There's of course a lot of discussion about like reaching out to people who toe the same line or like a similar line, right, and building those communities, but like reaching out to someone who not only like would not be interested or actively doesn't or like does not want to be a part of this or that, and like how do you speak to those kinds of people? And yeah, I think that's sort of like building the friendship and camaraderie, so
That's a great question, Dylan. Do you mind if I start with you, since that's kind of a central concept in your latest book, and then I'm sure that Jennifer and Sadie might want to add something.
Yeah, I think it's the question that you ask is kind of, I think, a central one to what organizing, community organizing, political organizing is. I don't think that we can discount people because they disagree with us, or that there isn't going to be some capacity to find overlap. Like, part of solidarity is also existing through difference as well. But the motive, I think about, I lived in Hungary for a year when I was going to school, and it was interesting, they had the pre-1990 era, then they had the era of crony capitalism, and then it was like EU integration, things were going to make things better. And, they have a right-wing build the wall type of leader who's, authoritarian, etc. But the argument that they make is that, that people were screwed over by the old Soviet system. They were screwed over by crony capitalism. They were screwed over by the EU. And now they need to like build the nation, close the wall, all of those things. I can understand rationally why that appeal might work with people. And I think the organizing challenge is to then go there as to like why people need to imagine something differently. And so when you see similarly in the States, the build the wall arguments, I lived in Haifa in Israel when the wall was being built back in 2003, 4. And just seeing the appeals to those types of arguments, which we see from the hard ideological right. And if we can turn it back into a question of the material gains for working class people and how to do that in solidarity, that's a conversation that can be had, that should be had. Because I think when I talk to my old elementary school friends, their grievances have to do with economics. It has to do with deindustrialization, loss of union jobs. And if they felt economically more secure, those appeals to them around some of the hard right ideological positions wouldn't be the same. I would also say that, you know, political parties as well, the NDP specifically, have done a poor job connecting with white working class people, frankly. And I do think that they've left a lot on the table in terms of how to organize, how to connect with people. And these are people that are probably going to vote NDP or Conservative, probably not Liberal, but I don't think that the proper mode of organizing has been in place. But I do believe engaging with people you disagree with is a fundamentally important part of organizing.
Thank you so much, Am. Jennifer, Sadie, would you like to add anything to this discussion on friendship?
I wouldn't mind jumping in. I think it's important, I mean, to talk across issues. I mean, our neighborhoods, and I'd like to, as a community organizer, I guess, in the past, to talk about communities and the fact that communities are wide and diverse, always have been. And it's really important to connect with people. Am talked about the people that might be on his Facebook page, and how for some of those individuals that he is engaged in quite a bit of dialogue and discussions. The other thing, in terms of our area where we live, our work, we engage with a lot of people that don't necessarily share the same perspective that we have, and include them in things, because we reach each other on different levels and in different ways, and keeping the door open for dialogue and discussions and support, I think actually brings people along. Some people getting to know a wide diversity of points of views and different people make them more open and willing to entertain and to voice their point of view in a safe environment. Not because they don't want to be challenged, because they don't mind being challenged, but the fear of being, called something that they may not like may limit some people. But again, being in spaces where they feel safe enough to be able to voice those concerns and then listen or voice their opinions and then be able to hear other people's points of view is how we move individuals. And one of the things I was going to mention around the committee, because I think a lot of people had some questions about why was the committee, the African Descent Committee, the VPD African Descent Committee formed in the first place, and what did we hope to accomplish, and why did we break up? The reason the committee decided to break up, of course, is because of a level of disrespect and dismissiveness, and the sense that on issues that were important to not only the Black community, a number of groups did surveys, including the commissions, and got lots of feedback from lots of different members of the Vancouver community, but much broader, that said that having police in schools were a problem. And the fact that a committee supposedly struck to hear from the African Descent Committee then weren't even allowed to speak at a board meeting where the matter was being discussed and a so-called final decision was supposedly going to be made, was just beyond the pale, and also to be quite rudely basically the attempt to throw us out. Obviously, people that watch the video know that we didn't allow ourselves to be thrown out. We made our point and then walked out. But again, I wanted to go back to this whole notion of what community is and what it looks like. And to me, it is really an important matter to be committed to being engaged in, and again, wherever that community is, and to have people in my neighborhood, which is really diverse on the east side of Vancouver. There is a wide diversity of people from different backgrounds who wind up at least a couple of times during the year getting together and having discussions about politics and life. And when any of those individuals are having problems with a family member or with kids or whatever, they can share that with other members in the community and get support. And we don't ask necessarily what their politics are, because obviously it would be quite broad. But again, that sense of community and knowing that it's a place that you can have a point of view and get it across, and we can say, I totally disagree with your point of view, and that's that, right? Anyway, belonging, as they say, which I know is mentioned in Am's book as well. But I think it's important for us to remember that doors have to be open, because and that we can be heard even in situations where it appears very bleak.
Thank you, Sadie. Jennifer, did you have anything you wanted to say in response to Dylan's question before we move on to our next?
Yes, very briefly. Dylan, thanks so much. I feel like that's a very generous question to ask, is how to make space and hear other people. I know personally that can be difficult sometimes, but a couple things on the municipal front is it's really important that we validate people who come forward wanting to share a different experience or a different perspective, provided that it's within upholding human rights. There's always that fear. And I think you mentioned some of the protests affecting your colleagues at 312. So same thing here, validating people that come forward and believing what they say. So often lately, especially at the school board, I hear a lot from parents, students, members of the public who are told, oh, sorry, like we don't have time to hear your point of view at an upcoming meeting. It's because maybe the elected folks don't agree with their point of view. So the worst thing we can do is suppress people's voices and perspectives and opinions, and especially from the public record. So that concerns me greatly. And I would say that if you ever hear of folks experiencing that kind of shutout from public decision-making spaces, to get in touch with folks like myself, Sadie and Am, and we would certainly be concerned and be able to raise attention to what's happening. But yeah, just kind of those three things come to mind for me about what you're posing, and would just say, like, we need to be so careful about that currently, because at school board that's happening more often than you'd like.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Dylan, I thank you for your question. And if you have a rejoinder, brother, I'm going to go to our next question now, but feel free to pipe in again. Larry Tallman, I see your hand up.
Hi there. I've been very impressed with the quality of the discussion and some of the really key elements around community and solidarity. My background most recently has been around climate change, and increasingly community and solidarity is going to be really important. Another reason for those two things being really important. But the question I have is going to go back to what Stephen brought up about systemic reasons for racism, and in particular, this is being put on by the VDLC and labor. And I'm curious how people see the labor market as being one of the key systemic reasons for racism. And or if that's not the key, then where are the other elements that are the ongoing reasons for racism to be part of our society? Thank you.
What a great question. I'll go to our esteemed speakers and ask, is there anyone who wants to answer that question first?
I would like to jump in. I think that it's broad. I think that often economics is used as a reason, an excuse for people behaving badly. I think a core part of racist attitudes and behaviors come out of, some of it is just the kind of biases that we have been exposed to in the history that we come from. Most Canadians don't remember that, in fact, rules and laws around immigration, and I'm thinking of even Black immigration from places like the US and other places in Europe to Canada, was problematic, and for a lot of other groupings as well. And Am mentioned what happened. Well, I think many of us know about what happened with the Kumagata-Maru. And again, that on the one hand, there was a policy that said that people could come here and settle, and then when they arrive, the borders being closed, and we have the example of also people leaving Europe and coming to Canada and being Jewish people and being blocked, both Canada and the US. The history of how some of it is how the privilege that particular groupings have had, that Canada and the US to a great extent saw itself is basically as European nations and people with a European background having more prowess and more importance than other groups of people had. And the important element of being committed to changing attitudes, even in the context of elements like Immigration Canada, where particular communities were blocked from full access to Canada, where our consulates are, and the fact that they're, in terms of Africa and other places, some other places, that there aren't many, for people to even have access to being able to apply to get into Canada, are all a part of where we are. But again, I think it goes, racism is something that exists. How we address it individually and collectively is important. Challenging some of the notions that exist about who have a right to be here and who doesn't. And again, it comes down to if you are here and you pass all of the entry prerequisites to be here, there's no reason why you should not be here, and you don't violate any of the laws, right? Being able to actually deal with overt racism when people are treated badly individually, and we've all had experiences with it, right? Having people walk past you. I think my first experience of dealing with it was at the border when the border agent said, "Oh, you can, you would not. You have to demonstrate that you qualify by the point system." Because I think I was down as a spouse, right? And then, and telling up the information once he did, he's oh, sorry, kind of thing. And then walking down the street in Vancouver before heading up to Kitimat and having someone spit on me as a Black person and basically said that person shouldn't be here. And I know other people have had other experiences that kind of those kind of overt incidences that can take place. But being able to go beyond that and not judging absolutely everybody by those kinds of incidences and being willing to challenge the systems that are in place in terms of policy to ensure that the kind of barriers and blocks that are in place in government policy that limit a more equitable system that recognize people's value and worth, regardless of who they are. And having a fairer system of having all people coming or entering Canada are things that I think many of us are still working on. And again, racism does exist, and we can't pretend that it doesn't. It is heartbreaking to watch children and adults, right, to watch them be mistreated on the basis of how they look or what people assume about them based on how they look, and being treated badly. And again, as much as we can work to end that and resolve those attitudes, and I think education is a major component for that. The problem is that for the most part, we don't know our history very well. But
Thank you.
education and moving forward, I think, is important. Sorry for a long-winded response to your question, but I think, yeah, that's
Thank
what
you, Sadie. Am or Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, and I don't mean to conflate the kind of international situation because each context is different. But whether we're looking at Erdogan in Turkey or Modi in India or Bolsonaro previously in Brazil before the recent elections, or in Argentina, and even in other places like the UK and others, the mode of creating, when people start to play out the border politics, which is you have an enemy from outside that is affecting, there's also then a desire to create an enemy within, and it becomes a mode of organizing, and there's a practical side to the way that people are mobilizing in an electoral sense, because either ultra nationalist or super wealthy people can't win elections just simply within their communities. They have to get other people to vote, and by mobilizing those grievances, particularly targeting working class people, it can lead to electoral victories in context. There's a pragmatic side. The Steve Bannons of the world are actively exporting that internationally in terms of the mode of organizing that they're trying to put out there. And so it needs to be combated at the level of the problem and the politics and the argument they're making that is appealing to people. And so I do think there's a deep challenge. The other side, the flip side of that as well, is that conservative organizations are making deep connections into immigrant and racialized communities around social conservatism or public safety, micro-targeting. This is the work that was done in Ontario under Harper and other places in the suburbs. And so, communities aren't monoliths. There's divides and differences between them. Oftentimes people, if one side of a community is with a group, then people want to have access to the other side. And so there's a splitting up that goes on in the mode of political organizing as well that is quite complicated. And say in the provincial election, places like Surrey, the Fraser Valley, Richmond, those types of modes of organizing are going to be important to the outcome of the election provincially.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, did you want to add anything or?
I think just a kind of different point of view, and I really am learning a lot from both what Sadie and Am have shared. Thanks, Larry. I think that's a really good question and something that I think a lot about the connections between systemic racism and how it plays out interpersonally. And I guess one of the key things is sort of that I'm seeing as a theme, both in electoral politics, but in our labor organizing too, is like this question of like, what's good enough for anti-racist action? And I feel like a lot of us are kind of stalling or stopping at representation. And that's what allows some of those other bigger forces to kind of swoop in and take us apart, essentially, and undo the good work that has been done in the system. So I think of an example that happened recently around the Joyce Collingwood neighborhood. And largely public education organizing is gendered, it's class, it's race-based. And the community around Joyce Collingwood had a school, Bruce Elementary, which was up for subdivision. And that community has a high number of people of color, families like living in 2 or 3 bedroom apartments, and the largest number of families in high rises. So green space, i.e. through the public education system, is sometimes the only kind of backyard for a lot of communities in that neighborhood, as well as the tree canopy coverage, which is very limited throughout the city, but especially in Southeast Vancouver. So the fact that you brought in climate justice, I think, is really on point, because I think what was being assumed is that these communities aren't paying attention. They're not in the room. Let's go ahead and subdivide, maybe sell or lease this section of their school land. And when you go there, you find out sort of who's using that public space. And it happens to be families who live in high rises who had no idea their land is being considered for subdivision until parents, mostly women, came up and started to raise awareness and launched a campaign, got their MLAs involved, got trustees involved. And so all this to say that it's very much like about race, class, family composition that intersects. And unless we can kind of show up for all of that, we might actually miss or even do harm to other communities that like we're thinking we're speaking on behalf of or for, but if we're not really listening or showing up for those discussions, I do worry about missing the mark of tackling systemic racism while kind of hearing and making space for the interpersonal stuff that's playing out.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Larry, if you will tolerate it, I've been an anti-racist educator and teacher for about 40 years. And if you don't mind, could I offer a few comments in response to your question? Because you asked us about, how racism is about labor practices, and our esteemed guests here are reminding us that we need to look at intersections. And I want to start with this whole issue about systemic racism. And I know it's very popular for the government to talk to us about racism is systemic. But then when we have all the workshops and materials, we end up sort of learning about how we can be nicer to each other on an interpersonal basis. And because the government has co-opted the term now, anti-racism, I just now talk about white supremacy. And I don't talk about it as like these fringe people in the Appalachian Mountains. White supremacy is the system that we have to target and name. And I disagree with the political economists and capitalists who say it started with capitalism. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. And I think that our guests today have reminded us about the roots of racism in the labor movement as well. So one of the issues that is my area of expertise is genocide. And for the last 30 years, I've been learning about Indigenous perspectives on genocide. And it's important for us to remember that racism is an ideology that grew out of Christian nationalism. Genocide and colonization started before capitalism. But by the time we reach the Enlightenment, it's no longer feasible to use religious knowledge to justify the kind of things Christians were justifying through, the white man's burden or the idea of manifest destiny, characterizing Indigenous peoples as, less than human, characterizing, African peoples as inherently enslavable. So these ideas are what morphed into the ideology and pseudoscience of race. And so racism became the new ideology that was used to justify this ongoing system of dispossession. And that system carries on today, although it's not only people defined as white who can participate, in the politics of racism in very different ways, through the ages. And so it's important. This is why, and I'm pay deep respect to, African and Caribbean scholars like Frantz Fanon, like Stephen Biko, like Charles Mills, who reminded us that, even the roots of democracy, lie in very racist discourse. That was like the European bourgeoisie, demanding new rights for a new class of landowners, land that had been pillaged and dispossessed, Indigenous peoples all over the world dispossessed. And so discussions about reparations today are certainly economic discussions, discussions about unfair labor practices, about a globe full of people wandering the globe, in search of economic, refuge. But all of those processes were set off by white supremacy. And the fact that, state-sponsored discourse takes us farther and farther away from understanding that, I think is why, many of us are flailing and searching for a place to understand, where this comes from and how do we link up with each other, and how do we build, solidarity across these differences. And, I think that when we talk about friendship, I just want to highlight the words of this amazing scholar, Frantz Fanon, for those of us who talk about, I myself, I use the term decolonization to describe the work I'm trying to do, and I don't use it in a metaphorical sense. There are real nations around the world that are trying to practice their inherent rights of sovereignty and self-determination. And so Fanon reminds us, he says, decolonization never takes place unnoticed, for it influences individuals and modifies them fundamentally. And I know that in my own work as a young woman, discrediting, marginalizing, calling me crazy, calling me angry. It's not what she's saying, it's how she says it. These are common ways of silencing anti-racism. And as time grew old, as I've had a lot of friends and family who have left me by the wayside because ideas about decolonization necessarily ask us to examine our own privilege. And as many Canadians know, we have the privilege of not wanting to do that. It's a willful kind of ignorance that we engage in. And so it's important to talk about when we speak the truth and we learn to speak it in a respectful way, as I've had tried to do through really decades of working with, elders from my own culture, from Lakota culture, from other cultures, is to understand that sometimes speaking that truth does bring estrangement from the groups that we originally belonged to. And so again, even in some social movements, you will find certain orthodoxies. This is something that I see today, is that it's very difficult to find a place in Canada right now to voice Indigenous people's concerns about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My father-in-law was one of the people who was there for decades, whose work they felt was, co-opted and kind of used to, ignore and silence concerns that Indigenous peoples were making at the level of the UN. And so, when Indigenous peoples, say things like Article 46 nullifies, the rest of UNDRIP, because it basically allows, settler states to remain in charge of discussions about Indigenous sovereignty. it is difficult often to find a space to have these discussions. And again, that's why it's important to remember that friendship can go, beyond whatever group we started off with. And those of us who live in urban centers know we've had to make our own families sometimes, being away geographically from our families. But the distance can also be emotional and spiritual and political. And so for me, friendship, my husband's nation means friendship. It's about, recognizing that there's always a way to move forward, searching for peace and justice and finding new friendship. Friendships are something that are always evolving, and there's always the possibility of new friendships too. So I just wanted to add that into the discussion. Thank you so much. Catalina, you've been waiting patiently to raise a comment. Please go ahead. I can't hear you, my sister. You're still muted. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you all. My name is Catalina, and it's a pleasure to be here today learning from you. And I'm just starting my pathway. Not only here in Canada, I've been here just for 7 years, but the pathway of advocacy and self-advocacy, especially for children. So I've been at the Vancouver School Board for 5 years as an educational assistant, or also called support worker. And the first time, I just want to ask for your advice of you. I mean, that being through this pathway longer than me, the first time I witnessed this situation in a classroom was maybe 2-3 years ago. It was first was a grade 1 and then a grade 2. They needed to use some plasticine to mold their faces with the color of their skin. So they needed to go to find out the color of the skin on those plasticine and made their faces. I saw many children crying when they weren't able to have the color of their skin, and then they needed to add or either more white or either more yellow, and they were always trying to compare. The other ones were finishing their faces, and they were still trying to find the mix of their skin color. And lately, Crayola, I want to think it was with a good intention, brought this new product to the market that are crayons and color crayons with the skin color. Mm-hmm. So this year, there is something in the curricula called We're All Different, but We're All the Same. And one of the approaches is they come into the classroom. It's a kindergarten class. It's the first experience in a school setting. They come into the classroom, they need to go to a table, and they need to find their skin color in those crayons, and they need to self-portrait. You can see, I literally could see their souls eroding the first time of school. Their first time of school. So I would like to know how we can do something, because I'm just a support worker, right? I'm not up to this systemic capitalism pyramid way of shaping socially and slavery. I'm not able to say anything because I'm not in charge of the classroom. So that's being also making me feel very sad, because okay, I'm here, I'm supposed to support, and the only thing I can do is provide some comfort to those kids that are crying and feeling so bad because they can't identify themselves as others are doing, right? With those crayons.
Your question is so important. Congratulations on embarking on this road of advocacy. And I just hear like your intelligence and your warmth and being able to decode this kind of misguided lesson, if you want to call it, one of like reinforcing difference. So I just want to thank you for bringing this question to us. Who would like to start from our esteemed speakers? Jennifer, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Catalina. Yes, I'm happy to start this and also finish it in that, Catalina, I hope you and I can get in touch because it really only changes when people like yourselves speak up because especially in the school system, there's the age dynamic and the hierarchy of the adults in the room and the children in the classroom. And especially when you're from different cultures, and I remember when I worked in the school district, even though I would work with students who are 19, 17, 16 years old, they're so afraid to ask their teacher questions or notify when something's not working because that's not what you do back home. And so just even giving kids the courage to speak up is difficult. So it's great that you, as an adult in that room, as an educator in that room, have witnessed something that's having potentially a pretty negative impact on kids and can speak up about it. That's one. So very grateful for you in that space as an educator and say that you have quite a bit of power because you've witnessed it and now you're talking about it. So I would say that's like fantastic and more important than just keeping it silent or those kids dealing with that by themselves. The second thing is how to raise it up in order to do something about it. And I would say like, I've heard of folks that find it very risky to speak up. They don't want to lose their job, or some people will get very defensive about what you're saying and how the dynamics are playing out in that room. So you can use other people to bring it up for you. So I would be glad to connect with you and just make sure I understand fully the situation and I can bring it up. And I often do that for parents who are afraid to speak up, to bring things forward anonymously or confidentially. Of course, if it goes to like a legal issue or some kind of appeal of a decision, at that point, the anonymity is no longer possible. But there is a point where we can identify and address the situations that are being raised, and we must. So I would say like, thank you so much for pointing that out. It sounds like such a difficult experience to be a part of. And the children may not know if you're an ally or not in the classroom. So this is one way to do something about it, to name it and then follow up. So hopefully you can get my contact from SEMA, but this is exactly my job. So I'm really glad to take it forward and off your hands. So that it's not something that kind of you're responsible to deal with. But all this to say, you really pointed to the fact that impact in all of our anti-racism work matters the most, that it doesn't matter the intention. And we don't know what the intention of that exercise is or was, but we know that the impact would be negative for kids and have racist implications, and that's where we can act. So yeah, really appreciate that. It's so practical and we can do something about it.
Absolutely. And Catalina, make sure that you get in touch with me and I'll connect you with Jennifer. And you are modeling what our, what our leaders here are saying today, is that speaking out is so important. And that's what you did. And thank you for, all the children who must have been just carrying that burden of having to participate in that. Am or Sadie, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
I'll just add one sort of small sort of broader point, and thank you for the question, Catalina. There's something about the state-sponsored multicultural part where the state for so long they do this through our educational system anyways. It's like you belong, but this is your designated space and place, and this is how we're going to name you. And that's so limiting in terms of this overlay of people and the kind of implications it has to how we socialize with one another and across difference. I have a friend of mine who grew up in Yugoslavia, then the Civil War happened, then it became Croatia, but he was from a mixed family, so he had a Muslim name. So because of this, we went from Yugoslavia to being in Croatia, his family multiple, but could never be Croatian. Like, this is why he's here. So this thing about we should be proud of our identities to be who we are, to bring our whole selves, yet from the outside we get designated or over designated in terms of what our place is, and we have to guard against that. It's a democratic kind of right to be able to resist those pieces. And so encourage you to meet with Jennifer, but also your union as well can be strong advocates on this front as well.
Great point. Thank you so much, Am. And of course, you know yourself better than anyone, whether your union is or your own local is a safe place where you can do that. So Am's giving you another avenue where we can, where you can follow up on this. And, Catalina, your question, it reminds me that, the problem of having anti-racism in the hands of non-white people, doing the leading, the destruction caused by well-intentioned people, cannot be estimated. And my husband is a residential school survivor, and like I survived Saskatchewan in the 60s. And so we made a deliberate decision not to send our son to school unless he wanted to. And we helped start a home learning program when, in our East Van neighborhood, so that, students who still wanted to get their credentials, could check in and create learning artifacts for a teacher to sign off on. And this was when they were starting Indigenous curriculum, more in Vancouver schools. And I have yet to meet a Native friend whose child has found comfort in this curriculum. So my son's experience in a home learning program, teachers who are supposed to be more aware of these issues. So he came to a home learning program one day and they told him, oh, today we're going to be learning about First Nations masks and we're going to be drawing them. And so my son respectfully asked, well, which nation are you talking about? Because I don't know if I have permission to do that. And she said, well, if you don't want to do a mask, you can do a totem pole. And he said, well, again, my people, like, we don't use masks or totem poles, so I don't know if I should do this. And he got told he was a troublemaker. And he came home very sad, not in tears, but very sad. And so here's a Lakota child trying to be respectful, learning about the territories he's in, not wanting to just trivialize important icons of the cultures here. And he gets called a troublemaker by a white teacher who doesn't really understand what she's doing, but she thinks she's being inclusive. So yeah, your question really reminded me of how those things are still coming up. Thank you so much, Catalina. Do we have any other questions or comments?
Can I just say just one thing to Catalina? Jennifer actually, Anna, touched on it and actually spoke at. There is no doubt that there are many situations that are hard and scary. And one wonders whether or not they can speak up. And it is really so moving, Catalina, for you to speak about this matter, to raise it, to be willing to raise it, and to figure out ways of addressing it effectively. And it's also really interesting that organization like Crayola continues to produce, and Band-Aids, and we can go through a whole list, continue to produce products that are problematic, and implying that their skin tone or whatever, because they have been challenged in the past about those kinds of assumptions and decisions. So on another level, those groupings have been challenged, but maybe there's also more that can be done. There's things that can happen at the school board level, but maybe there's a larger discussion to be had and a matter to be addressed too. And I just wanted to say that, and thank you for bringing this up. It's important. Thank you.
Thanks again, Catalina. And we're about 10 to 1 now, so I'm not seeing any other hands. So before I thank you all for giving your precious time on this Sunday, I'm going to turn to my co-chair, Gina, who has something to say. Go ahead, Gina.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly mention that we have some door prizes today to give out, and I've randomly drawn from the participants list, and I'll be reaching out to you after the meeting through the mailing list that you use to subscribe. And personally, I want to thank you all, the speakers and the participants today, for such an important and informative discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina, and I echo your words wholeheartedly to our speakers today. You've given us so much good advice and things to think about. And so we thank you. And to all the people here today, if you are interested in joining VDLC's Anti-Racism Committee, we welcome you. We welcome you to join the work that we're doing in the committee, or just to get in touch with us and give us your guidance and your concerns. So that we can make sure that we use our voice and our platform to make sure we're raising the issues that you're concerned about. And so with that, I want to thank each and every one of you today for joining us. Sadie, Jennifer, and Am, thanks again for your wonderful contributions to the discussion today. Be well, everyone. Enjoy the semi-sunshine for the rest of the day. Oh, just before we sign off, Colette. Hi, Colette, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, please. Just before we sign off, Colette. Hi, Colette, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, please.